You're listening to Nature as Beloved, Nature as Self, a podcast about wilderness Christian mysticism. I'm your host, Stephen Hatch, a contemplative living in New Mexico and former faculty at Naropa University. For over 45 years, I've been leading a simple lifestyle, combining family life with meditation, silence, and solitary time in the great outdoors. Along the way, I've developed an outlook rooted in Christian spirituality, informed by the world's great mystical traditions, and inspired by the wisdom found in nature. I'll be joined by my co-host, Will Warwick, also a contemplative, nature lover, and religious studies scholar. This podcast is for kindred mystics, lovers of nature, and people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious. It's for those who are genuine seekers of truth, goodness, and beauty. And it's for those who want to live a more authentic life. Please join us as we explore the vast landscape of this contemplative tradition.
Good morning, Stephen.
Good morning, Will.
How are you doing today?
I am doing very well.
It's an exciting day for us as this is our first episode of Nature as Beloved, Nature as Self.
Yes, I'm really looking forward to this podcast series.
So am I. It's perhaps been a long time coming.
Yes, you had to convince me to do a podcast series.
So this podcast is about wilderness Christian mysticism. And for our listeners who may not know what that is, can you briefly just tell us what this is and what it's about?
Yes, wilderness Christian mysticism is simply a way of articulating our experience in nature from a perspective that comes out of the mystical or contemplative tradition of Christianity. It isn't tied to any dogma, but there's a sense that this tradition offers some very refreshing ways to look at our experience with nature, including seeing nature as a kind of beloved with whom we have a love affair, and a presence with whom we discover union and discover our true self in the process. So this enables us to articulate an important element of our experience of nature.
What does that have to do with Christianity?
Well, it has to do with Christianity in the sense that wilderness Christian mysticism is permeated by a kind of warmth, a kind of sense that even if nature on one level doesn't seem to care about your individuality, on another level you feel affirmed, and there's this sense of warmth which comes from the presence of Christ. Also, there's this sort of playful interplay back and forth between you and nature, this sort of circular movement between the different aspects of our wilderness experience, the beloved aspect, the self aspect, your own individuality, nature as billions of years old. That is very much rooted in the whole Christian approach to spirituality.
Is this affiliated with any kind of Christian denomination or institution? What are we talking about here?
That's a really good question, Will. This wilderness Christian mysticism is not associated with any one Christian denomination or institution. It does grow out of history, especially out of American history, of the Transcendentalist movement, which was rooted in a kind of a Protestant connection to nature, like of Thoreau and Muir and others. But it's kind of an alternative spirituality that doesn't involve needing to be part of an institution, although a person who is a practitioner of wilderness Christian mysticism might also be part of an institution. But it's not something that is required. Indeed, it's as though nature is the church, nature is the community, and you're together there with all of the other lovers of nature. So in a sense, you really are forming a community.
And for anyone who's listening in and might be interested in learning more about this, who might benefit from learning about wilderness Christian mysticism in more depth?
I'd say anyone who spends a lot of time out in nature, perhaps fishing, backpacking, hiking, river rafting, skiing, cross country skiing, that feels the hunger to articulate what's the meaning of this experience. In other words, I know it feels good and I love adventure, but what's the meaning of it in my life? How do I articulate this, for lack of a better word, theologically? How do I articulate it philosophically? What does this say about the source of it all? How does this relate to the ultimate reality, the ultimate mystery? So, where does my experience in nature fit in? And then, how do I bring it into my everyday life? Do I have practices that I can develop when I'm out in nature that I can then bring into busy life in town? So, any person that loves being out in nature but wants to articulate some sort of spiritual vision would be interested in this.
Very fascinating. And it makes me wonder this or ask this question. How might being able to articulate that meaning or spiritual vision be of benefit to any one person or to us as a collective society?
Well, I think that our minds are part of our being. I know there's a current term that people like to use, oh, don't overthink it. There's been a tendency, so we have this sort of dualism in Western society between mind and body, right? So for generations, for centuries, probably the mind was emphasized and the body was de-emphasized. So spirituality just became, oh, what do you believe about such and such a thing? And the body was basically ignored. Well, now the pendulum has swung almost exactly to the other direction, that everything is body oriented, body practices, and then we have yoga and the fitness industry and the adventure itself. Gosh, I love to get out, and as John Muir says, sometimes we learn more in our experience of nature through our feet than through our minds. But a wilderness Christian mystic realizes that these two, mind and body, are not separate. So that, for example, you can have an insight, and people say, "Oh, don't be in your head." Well, anytime I feel truly that I have an insight that comes to me in the mental aspect of my being, it excites me. It's enlivening. I feel it in my emotions. I feel it in my body. I'm excited. So mind and body really aren't two separate things. They're sort of aspects of one another. So wilderness Christian mysticism simply recognizes this, that the aspect, the cognitive aspect, a philosophical, theological aspect, needs to be articulated to be a part of who we are as human beings. We're trying to articulate, what are we feeling in our bodies as it bubbles up into our mind? What is that? So I think it has a lot of value in that kind of way.
Stephen, you've mentioned before that the old story is failing, and you wonder about whether there's a new story emerging. Can you give voice to that some more here for our listeners?
Yes, for sure. The old story, there's many aspects to it. In the Christian view, there's this kind of substitutionary atonement view that turns many people off these days, and it's sort of oriented around guilt and, quote, sin and punishment, and so that God has to send Christ in order to atone for those. Well, that story, not only is it relatively late in Christian history, that is the 11th century, it has tended to dominate many people's view of Christianity, and it simply doesn't resonate with many people, especially young people. For one, it comes from a Roman legal kind of view, and people just don't resonate with that. And along with that goes this view of individual salvation. And that is a flaw, I would say, in all of the great wisdom traditions, this tendency to focus on the individual and what is their destiny after they die, or even if it's not heaven, is it moksha in Hinduism? Is it nirvana in Buddhism? It's an individual. Uh, we are way past the time when we should be focusing on the individual's destiny. We need to focus on how we're all a part of something together. And so if one is, quote, saved or made whole, the entire is along with it. Whether you want to use the Christian metaphor of the body of Christ, and every species, say, as a different part of that body, heart, mind, lungs, hair, toenail, and every part is needed, or whether you want to use an indigenous perspective of the web of life that we're all a strand of, or one of the Buddhist traditions talks about the net of Indra, that we're each a jewel in a node of a web, of a net that reflects every other jewel. We really need a new story that includes everything so that the well being of the human, including our spiritual well being, is connected to the well being of all the other species, for sure, all other cultures, all other religions, but of the planet itself. So that's a part of the news story that is desperately needed.
You mentioned us being past thinking about heaven in the future, or that being the ultimate end of a spiritual practice. It just makes me think about how Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven is at hand in the
Yeah,
present
that is so
tense,
true.
here and now. So how does the mystical side of Christianity, in this tradition in particular, help us to accept that invitation from Jesus more fully and enter into that reality?
Well, he says, "Come unto me, all you that are heavily burdened, and I will give you rest." Our experience in nature is not only of invigoration, but also of a sense of rest, a sense of peace. And so that's what many of us go to nature for. Society is a bubbling cauldron of competing energies and conspiracy theories right now. And we go into nature to find a center, to find peace. And so that's exactly the peace that Jesus experienced. I mean, every day he went out before he taught the crowds, he went out by himself into the foothills there around Judea and prayed and meditated and was with the pines and the birds. So we're simply doing what he did.
Yeah.
Uh, for all of his spiritual maturity, divinity, even Jesus needed to do that. Even the Dalai Lama has to go out into the natural world and keep reaffirming what he's about. So, this is something that's true for us as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And recently I've been reading through the Gospel of Luke and have been mindful of that rhythm of Jesus, him in the
Yeah.
city, around other people, involved in his ministry. But then you notice too that he takes the time to go out into the mountains with his disciples, or to go alone and pray. And I think that is a very healthy rhythm.
Yes.
For anyone who might be skeptical about Christianity at large, or about Christian mysticism, as we're talking about here, what might you have to say to them?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it's important with every tradition, and indeed with our own position on anything, to distinguish between the fruit and the rind. And currently, we're in an age when the rind of Christianity, namely judgmentalism, exclusivism, dualism, is being emphasized. But it's often forgotten that there's a fruit inside, and that if you peel the rind off, there are some very valuable insights and perspectives. And it's important to remember, I mean, people are starting to see it. When I taught at Naropa, people were seeing it in Buddhism, that some of the students were tempted to think there was only rind in Buddhism because of some of the misdeeds of some of the teachers. But there as well, there is a fruit and there's a rind, and sometimes the messenger of the fruit is a pretty flawed person, like all of us are. So the Christian tradition is like all of them, and I have to say that what happens, of course, is we think that we're going to get rid of a tradition that perhaps we had embraced or were raised in, and we're going to form our own pure view or philosophy. But guess what? Our own view is going to have rind as well. So I think that one of the exciting things about the spiritual journey is digging underneath the rind in order to find the fruit in absolutely everything that we go through, in every tradition that we're attracted to, in all people, is looking for that fruit. And that's really the contemplative or the mystical mindset, to look underneath things in order to find the hidden treasure. We all love a good treasure hunt. I mean, as kids, that's so exciting to go on a treasure hunt. It's not just lying there on the surface, you've got to look for it. And
Yes.
the search, the process of looking is exciting.
Yeah.
So similar with the spiritual journey, it's not going to all be laid out for us. There's going to be some peeling of rind in order to find the delicious fruit. And there's going to be different kinds of rinds and different kinds of fruits. But we don't want to stick with the rind and say, oh, this tastes awful. Peel the rind off and find the fruit. So I think in our time, that's what needs to happen with all the wisdom traditions. And in this case, with the Christian tradition, there is some incredible fruit inside.
Yes. 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 Yes, there is. And that is such a healthy and helpful perspective to have. I've known you
Yes.
for a few years and you've talked about that before. And I have come to embrace that more wholeheartedly. And in doing so, that has helped me to embrace my own Christian roots more
Mm.
wholeheartedly. So let's look at what wilderness Christian mysticism is in more depth. We're going to break this down piece by piece and starting with mysticism. What is mysticism, Stephen?
Okay, well, I would see mysticism as that sense of oneness with divine reality, with ultimate reality. And it is a non dualistic tradition. It's in all of the world religions, really, but there's a sense of non duality. There is this oneness where everything holds together. And generally, there are disciplines that help us to find this oneness. When you say, well, things like silence and solitude, simplicity, journaling, and meditation.
Yeah, I agree. I would add yoga and mindfulness to that mix. And you're absolutely right that many of the world wisdom traditions do point to that union with the divine or greater
Yeah.
self. What is Christian mysticism?
Well, for me, Christian mysticism is that this oneness or this non duality is permeated by a radiant sense of warmth and love. And that really, in essence, for me, is what the presence of Christ is about. It is this personal sense of love and radiant warmth that permeates the union. But I think another thing about Christian mysticism, if you look at it in terms of comparing it to other non dual traditions, it emphasizes a kind of alternation back and forth between having a love relationship, a sense of longing for the divine. So that would be the divine as beloved. And on the other hand, a sense of identification with becoming one substance with the divine, and that would be the divine as self. And so Christian mysticism, the oneness is not as it might be in some of the Eastern traditions, in a fusion so that the divine becomes self, but instead is between the two of the divine as beloved and the divine as self. For example, Martin Buber, the famous Jewish theologian, said, That spirit is not in the I or in the thou, that is the other, but between I and thou. So there's that sense of constantly moving back and forth between longing for more and more of the divine, and then a sense of incarnating or having a sense of fusion with the divine.
Yeah, that's wonderful. When I hear you describe that Martin Buber quote, the I and the Tao, that just sounds so much like Trinitarian language.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that's another aspect for many people. The Trinity is just some sort of abstract dogma, but for the Christian mystic, it is a vibrant aliveness. The early church fathers and mothers talked about what they called perichoresis, which is a Greek word that means to dance around. And so that means that you've got sort of these two aspects: the transcendence, that's the beyondness, and the immanence, that is the divine within, kind of dancing with each other, almost a shape shifting. So the very moment that you're led beyond this world into something that grounds it, you're automatically right back in the world. So there's this constant sort of playful, almost trickster like shape shifting into each other. So, for example, if spaciousness it represents the presence of God, and you see that spaciousness as the true reality, then suddenly all these forms appear like echoes out of nowhere. And that would be, the presence of Sophia or the sacred feminine, perhaps. And then if you see form as the true reality, and suddenly it becomes transparent to spaciousness. And so there's this constant move back and forth between the two, which is actually quite playful. That's that perichoresis, the dance around.
So would you say then, we're still talking about Christian mysticism, that really the goal is to participate in that relationship?
Absolutely. Participate in that relationship, that dance back and forth between transcendence and immanence, or you might say the divine masculine God, the divine feminine, Sophia, which is something that we'll get into in Christian mysticism. There is that direct feminine presence, and being in the non-gendered place in between the two. So there's that constant dance back and forth, that participation in that movement that also goes beyond us, because it's been going on for billions of years.
Yeah, I find it fascinating the way that you describe that interplay. Um, Sometimes it seems, when we're talking about mysticism in other traditions, that the goal is almost to reach a summit of some kind, to
Right.
achieve union with the divine, to reach enlightenment, self realization, and that's it. Yet, what I hear you describing sounds like something that's much more dynamic
Yes.
and lively and ongoing.
Absolutely, and playful. And in the Christian tradition, there is this sense of self-emptying. Of kenosis is the Greek word that is used for that. But it's as though the divine self-empties into us, we self-empty into the divine. The transcendent aspect, shape shifts, self-empties into the immanent withinness, and vice versa. So yeah, it's just this constant interplay. I mean, Rumi has a passage where he says, "Seek the divine in the sky and the moon, and it shines instead like a reflection from the water. Seek it in the water, and then it shines from the sky. Start to write God's name on the tablet, and the name disappears in the very act of writing." So it's kind of that playfulness.
Yeah. One thing I've been pondering as we've been getting ready for this episode is, yes, mysticism is about union with the divine. And I think sometimes something that, might be misunderstood is that, oh, there's the divine wherever it is, and we need to link up with it, that's missing, that the relationship isn't there.
Yeah.
Whereas what I've come to understand, and again, what I've learned from you, is that the relationship with the divine is there. The divine is present at all times. It's not about achieving it, it's not about linking what's separate,
Yes.
but it's about attuning to what is already. it's about deepening that relationship, not establishing a new relationship, but just going deeper into that relationship with the divine. Is
Yeah,
that?
that's really well put, Will. There is that sense that the relationship, the interaction, the union is already present. And so, whereas, say, in Western philosophy, you start with individual things and then you try to figure out how they all fit together, in mysticism, you start with that sense of union or unity and then see how they individuate within that unity. So, it's the other way around.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's add that third element to this conversation, the wilderness piece of wilderness Christian mysticism.
Yeah.
What is that?
So, if Christian mysticism is the divine as beloved, divine as self, and we sort of oscillate in the middle place between those two, and that's where the true oneness is. In wilderness Christian mysticism, the divine is encountered primarily in the landscape, in the wild places. So it becomes nature as beloved, nature as self. And that is the primary source of finding that. Now, here's the thing, because the natural world includes things like rocks and plants and skies and clouds, uh, the Christian mystics use not only the human personal aspect when talking about the divine, talking about God, but also they use landscape imagery, which I find very powerful. In fact, that's what attracted me in the first place to Christian mysticism. So, for example, God is viewed, say, by Meister Eckhart as a ground of being. Or Eckhart and other German mystics talked about the abyss within, or the canyon, and the divine presence dwells at the depth of that canyon. Or there's this expanse or this sky in which the divine is present. Or there's this sense of flow. You know, Jesus talked about the rivers of living water that spring up within us. So there is the metaphor of the water. So wilderness Christian mysticism realizes that it's always both and. There's the sort of human aspect of the divine, and there is the transhuman aspect of the divine rooted in nature. So, you know, just as you go out into places like the Grand Canyon and see billions of years of Earth history laid out before you that seem impersonal, they give you a sense of your smallness, but they also give you a sense that you're identified with something much bigger than just your own little ego self.
So what would you say to someone who might call this pantheism,
Yeah, that's a good
or
question.
or just what you're doing is nature worship? How would you respond to someone who says something like that?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Will. So this would be panentheism, which is that the divine is in all things, but is also beyond all things. So here's the analogy I like to use. Just as mystical Christians would say that the Bible contains the Word of God, especially when spoken to you in the moment, but you can't say it is the Word of God because that would reduce the divine to words.
Hmm.
Similarly, you would say that the natural world contains the divine presence, but isn't exactly the same thing as that presence. I mean, we look at tornadoes, hurricanes, the coronavirus, and we realize, well, the divine is within all of those things, suffering with us and working through those things, but also goes beyond them.
Well, Stephen, you've mentioned it already a few times, referring to the divine as beloved, divine as self, and then wilderness as beloved, wilderness self. From that, we've got our title, nature as beloved, nature as self. I was wondering if you can elucidate on that a little bit more for our listeners as to what exactly that means.
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. So, nature as beloved, well, I tend to often see this in terms of the beauty of nature: sunset, wildflower meadow, dynamic sky. Here in New Mexico, we have these beautiful sunsets and these virgas, these strands of rain that are coming that don't quite touch the ground. So that beauty gives you a longing and a sense, oh, I want to somehow be one with this. I mean, this is what people feel, when they take pictures. They somehow want to bring it home with them. But in Wilderness Christian Mysticism, we're interwoven into this relationship, this sense of longing for the beauty of nature. So that would be the nature as beloved. It's always beyond this. There's always more to long for, to yearn for. I find in my own life that one landscape will be, it's as though it calls me, yeah, I've got to go to the Red Rock Desert of Moab. And then another time, oh my, I'm being called to go to the Pacific Northwest, to those lush forests. Here in New Mexico, oh, I want to get out and explore these canyons, multicolored rock, and the mountains that tower above. So there's a sense that nature is always beyond us and always beckoning us toward deeper and deeper union. So that's the beloved part. On the other hand, there is the nature as self, which is that we start to identify with the aspects of nature that we've had a relationship with. So, for example, we start to identify with the spaciousness of the sky, and we don't constrict around our emotions and thoughts so much. Or we identify with the beauty of the wildflower meadow, and we feel self-confident, and we put our insights and our vision out into the world, just as those wildflowers are putting out their color and fragrance to all of the pollinators. So there's a sense of fusion there that gives us a sense of liberation, especially in the midst of everyday life with human concerns, which can be quite challenging.
Would you say there's a relationship between the outer landscape and the inner landscape?
Yes, there is a mirroring that is going on. So when the early Christians, say St. Paul, want to talk about the presence of Christ, he described Christ as a kind of mirror of the true self. He said that as we contemplate the glory of the Lord as though in a mirror, we become one with that presence from glory to glory. Similarly, in the presence of nature, nature becomes a mirror of our true self. And indeed, we could say that all of our selfhood is mirrored in something that is other, but yet is at the same time one with us. So there are so many times that those of us who are nature lovers, we just can't see the core goodness of ourselves. We got all wrapped up in our neuroses and our issues with people. We go out into the landscape and we start to see in this mirror, oh, I'm actually spacious in my true self. Oh, I'm actually flowing like the river. Oh, there's an inner beauty that is intoxicatingly wonderful to the divine beloved. So, yes, absolutely, nature becomes a mirror in which we see our true self.
Do you have a recent example of something like that for you when you've been outdoors?
Yeah, I was hiking last week in southern Colorado near the New Mexico border, South San Juan Wilderness. And I had been struggling, trying to engage in my spiritual practices, and I felt like I was doing them pretty weakly. That is Weakly, as we so often do. After all, the spiritual life is practiced like we practice an instrument or a sport, so it doesn't always look pretty. And so I was just kind of in this sort of work mode. And then suddenly I was about 6 p.m. and I was hiking, and there were robins singing, hermit thrushes singing, and the aspens were backlit, the fresh aspen leaves that had just come out, that beautiful lime green. And I suddenly had a sense, oh, I want to take delight in and joy in these practices. It's not just a thing to work through. There's a joy, and you can actually practice taking a joyful mindset then as you go throughout the day. So suddenly it was like a revelation that don't forget the joy, don't forget the delight. That's what motivates us to continue on our journey.
I 100% resonate with that, that the joy is such a powerful motivator that pushes us, urges us on, and sustains us along the way.
So, Will, do you have any recent experiences that are like that?
I do. I can relate to that for sure. What's coming to mind is the recent trip to the Hoh rainforest and being there on the Hoh River. It's been a while since I've stood on a riverbank, and that was helpful for me to remember that life is in constant flux. All things are impermanent, and
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
was helpful for me because right now I'm in the middle of a job search, and often I find it helpful to
yeah.
remember that quality of the river and to just relax into the flow
The
of
flow,
life
yes.
rather than staying still and rigid, but actually stepping into the water and participating in that flow, in that relationship that we described before, participating in the dynamic ebb and flow of being in relationship with God and others in life in general.
I can relate to that. Yeah, that's beautiful.
So that helped me to find ease over the weekend and to continue forward
Mm.
into this week with that perspective.
Yeah, I'm so glad Jesus used that metaphor several times, rivers of living water that spring up from within us. So something so refreshing and liberating about that.
Yeah, and the living water is something that I always think about when we talk about kenosis, that
Mm.
self-emptying quality of God.
Yeah.
I think of the mountains and the rivers, as you can see the image behind me. Um, yeah, the water flowing from the mountaintops. That it's this ever continuing self-emptying of God, His love, His mercy.
Yeah, and it gives a sense of delight to that self emptying, just as the glaciers are, melting into the rivers, and you hear the singing of all of those rivulets coming out of the glaciers. There's a feeling of delight that seems to be there.
There is great delight, and even when I practice relaxing into that flow, it's again not so much something I have to do. I don't have to reach the mountaintop. It's not something I have to achieve. It's actually something, and this is what centering prayer has taught me. I just need to relax and open my heart
Yeah,
to receive
absolutely.
and to be filled and to allow the spirit and love to move through me instead. And that fills me with much greater hope than, because it's beyond me.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's grace.
You mentioned centering prayer, which some of our listeners may not be familiar with, and we'll have to talk about that in some of these episodes. But yeah, that's that letting go into something bigger.
Well, what can people expect going forward in this podcast series?
Well, I think it will evolve and take on a life of its own. That's one thing I've discovered, that you have certain plans, but the podcast takes on a life of its own. But they can expect to uh, see different aspects of the wilderness Christian mystical tradition, uh, the different metaphors. We can talk about the ground of being and the canyon, and the flowing river. But also, we'll talk a lot about the uh, sacred masculine and feminine dimensions of the spiritual journey, as well as the non gendered aspects of the spiritual journey. In our time, we really need a sense of the sacred feminine. And a lot of people don't realize that the Christian mystical tradition has a vibrant sense of the feminine. And also, I think we'll talk about, since there's so much talk in our society about the toxic masculine, what's the sacred masculine? But in addition, we will probably be talking about different of the mystics and what they have to teach us throughout the various eras of Christian history, and what are some of the issues that are occurring in our everyday world that people were wondering, well, what does mysticism have to say about that? What is a nature-based kind of Christian mysticism have to say about these issues. So I see us expanding in quite a few directions potentially.
Indeed, it is a vast landscape for us to explore.
Yes, with many canyons to explore, and forests and mountaintops and rivers.
Yeah. So, Stephen, you have a very unique perspective. And we're talking about wilderness Christian mysticism. And I already know a little bit about your background, but perhaps for our listeners and those who are new to you, can you talk a little bit about your background and all the elements that converge to make up wilderness Christian mysticism?
Yes, absolutely. Spiritually, in terms of tradition, my grandfather was Armenian. His name was Hachadorian. He shortened it to Hatch when he came here on the early part of the 20th century. So his relatives would have been part of the Armenian Apostolic Church or the Orthodox Church, which really, from that tradition, I really absorbed the sense of uh, divinization, that the human becomes divine, a sense of emphasis on the light of the divine presence. On my mom's side, they were prominent Pennsylvania Quakers, the Brintons. Howard Brinton was a 20th century Quaker who really brought the mystical tradition back into the Society of Friends. So, from the Quaker tradition, I really absorbed that sense that um, everyone and everything has the presence of Christ already dwelling within them, the inner light. And as George Fox said, we're meant to travel throughout the world seeking to answer to that of God in everyone. And of course, in the Quaker tradition, there's that priesthood of all believers teaching that every person in a silent meeting is a minister. So that has influenced me. Then my parents raised me in an evangelical tradition, and there I got to know the Bible pretty well and the sense of warmth and fellowship that I absorbed. And then later on, when I was in college, I got in touch with the contemplative tradition through some teachers that had been monks. And from there, I learned a lot from the Catholic tradition. I think the Catholic tradition has probably some of the most detailed uh, sort of roadmaps of the mystical journey. I think of people like Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross. So the Catholic aspect there really affected me. I tend to see myself as a part of what's called the invisible church. That is, I go out into the natural world and I can feel the presence of friends and family far and near all around me, as well as the various aspects of the landscape. There's a sense of communion that's happening. So, this is a big part of my background. When I was a kid, I felt inferior to people at school, and I'd go out into the woods and feel a sense of consolation, to feel a sense of dignity as I was exploring, say, crayfish, under rocks and looking at pond microorganisms under the microscope and catching butterflies. And so gradually, as I became an adult, I realized, oh, well, my spiritual journey really is intertwined with nature, and my uh, devotion to the Christian tradition is intertwined with nature. So I made that more explicit and really delved into the work of John Muir, who was a boyhood hero for me in the third grade, and that has continued on throughout my life. His buoyant passion for nature and sense of union with nature. So, I guess to summarize, I would see my own journey in terms of a tree. I've got roots in the Orthodox tradition of Armenia and in the Quaker faith. And then I have roots in the evangelical tradition, Baptist. And then the trunk of that tree, I learned quite a bit from the Catholic mystical tradition as well as the Orthodox mystical tradition, and then also the Protestant mystical tradition. So that would be the trunk. But then the branches and leaves that has branched out into insights from various traditions, especially Buddhism, indigenous spirituality, Hinduism, Sufism, and others. So the way I see it is I'm all of those at the same time. I could never get rid of my roots because they're part of who I am, or the trunk. So I am, like all of us are, the roots, the trunk, and the leaves all at the same time.
It's very beautiful and also sounds very enriching.
So, Will, I've talked about my spiritual background and how it led to this current quest, this contemplative quest. So, what's your background? I know some of the details, but what is your spiritual background that has led you into this common work that we're doing together?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, similar to you, my journey began on the East Coast, right across from Pennsylvania, there in New Jersey.
Ah, yes, I used to go backpacking in the Pine Barrens.
Yeah, that's South Jersey. I'm actually not too familiar with South Jersey. I grew up in northern New Jersey, so
Ah,
more of a mountainous foothill region.
okay.
I was raised there in a Irish Catholic family, so that kind of formed my foundation. I grew up believing in God, going to mass, Sunday school, praying, etc.
Yes.
And then later on, I attended a small liberal arts school there in North Jersey, Ramapo College.
Okay.
While I was there, I was studying psychology and became more interested in things such as faith, religion, spirituality.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean I became more interested in Christianity at large, began returning to my Catholic roots, and was also drawn to the Eastern traditions, yoga, Hinduism,
Hmm.
Buddhism, and met people from these traditions, formed friendships with people from these traditions. And, oddly enough, growing up in the Catholic faith, I didn't know what monks and nuns were until I was in college. And then I went on retreat with one of the groups on campus. We went to the Bronx and spent time with the Franciscan Friars of the Renewal. And that was my first encounter with one of the religious orders or monastic traditions within the Catholic faith.
Okay.
And then within like a 2 week span, I also went on a retreat with another group and encountered a Buddhist monastic community for the first time.
Was it Tibetan or Zen or?
It was in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh.
Okay.
And he was there that day too. He gave a Dharma talk, which was very powerful.
Wow. Yeah.
So both of those experiences touched upon something deep within me and have left a lasting impression and have been very formative in my journey. Because really, without those experiences, I would not have found my way to Naropa University. I left New Jersey and moved to
Mm.
Colorado in 2015. I began in their Masters of Divinity program, thinking I might become a chaplain. But midway through that program, realized that wasn't what I wanted to do, at least not at that time. So
Yes.
I shifted my focus and completed the Master's in Religious Studies. And, it was there where we met. Midway through my academic journey there, I took your course on Christian mysticism.
That's right.
And that was where I really, during that period of time, just studying world religions was bringing me back to my Catholic faith, but also studying Christian mysticism helped me to even embrace it more wholeheartedly, to see those contemplative dimensions and to meet some of the mystics and saints through that course.
Yes, I remember you were very engaged in the class. You were one of the most engaged students.
And I also thought you were a very engaging teacher too. You brought a freshness and enthusiasm to each class, which is always appreciated as a student. That makes it fun. So that, like I was saying a minute ago, it was my study of world religions, interreligious dialogue, and Christian mysticism that helped me to embrace my roots. Because I do see in the Catholic faith a wealth of spiritual wisdom in the community of saints,
Absolutely.
the monastic communities. In my time in Colorado, I would often visit St. Benedict's in Snowmass, which is a community I know you're familiar with too. So I got to meet some of the brothers there and spend time there on several retreats. So, that was a little bit of my journey spiritually. And since then, I've continued to grow in the faith, learning from it, participating in parish life, both in Colorado and later in Washington, where I've moved to. But speaking of the spiritual journey, I also wanted to say that I find your metaphor of the tree to be very helpful. However, in my case,
Mm.
and as mentioned before, my roots are in the Catholic faith. My trunk formed by others in the larger Christian community, you and others that I've met of Christian background. And my branch is consistent of insights from other religious traditions or other disciplines such as psychology, etc.
Yeah.
But I've been playing with this too, and I like to think of this using kind of a watershed metaphor. I imagine myself as a tree alongside a river, surrounded by a mountain range with its many peaks and summits, and the water that flows past me, that nourishes me, all empties from the creeks and streams flowing from the mountains of Christianity, Buddhism, and all the other disciplines I've mentioned.
That's beautiful.
And lastly, I just want to speak to the nature piece a little bit. My love of the outdoors began in New Jersey, although I kind of took that for granted at the time. I grew up in a woodland community and would walk through forest trails to get to school and other places. My summers were filled with times at the ocean, what's known as the Jersey Shore. And later on, as a young adult, I discovered the Appalachian foothills in North Jersey, began hiking there, and was captivated by it all. And in those early years, I found refuge in nature. I found it to be a source of peace, a place where I could go, pray, reflect, and do so more clearly. And that has remained so for me since. And after moving to Colorado for my graduate studies, I didn't move to Colorado for the outdoors. However, my love of the outdoors only deepened beyond what I could have anticipated. And early on, while I was there, I stumbled upon a quote by John Muir that rang true for me then and still does.
What was that quote, Will?
Oh, that quote, that great quote. Everyone needs beauty as well as bread. Places where people can pray in and play in, where nature may give strength to body and soul alike.
That's beautiful.
And it was later on, midway through my graduate training that I met you and discovered that there was much more to Muir. You're a Muir scholar of sorts. You've written books about him, and through those books, I was able to gain a greater appreciation of the outdoors that allowed me to find greater meaning through my own experiences, or rather my own connection with nature. Yeah.
It's wonderful how there's those figures that really have influenced us.
Yeah.
John Denver led me to Colorado. He was singing during my high school years.
Yeah, and I grew up with John Denver kind of in the background. My parents were from your generation as well, and I heard those songs on the radio or at home at times. And when I was in Colorado, naturally, I started listening to him a little bit more myself. It's so beautiful to be driving through the mountains and hearing someone sing about the mountains.
Oh, absolutely. And you've been 3 years now in Cascadia in Washington State?
Yeah, so as of this month, I've been living in the Pacific Northwest, Washington, the state of Washington, for 3 years. And the journey continues. The love of the outdoors continues. I continue to grow in my faith. And I'm also at a point, too, where I want to help others. I want to help others experience more of the beauty that's found all in nature, in Christian mysticism, and life overall. And that's really what brings me to this quest and to this podcast, and why I am so glad and grateful that we've reconnected more recently. And here we are.
Well, that's beautiful, Will. I hadn't heard all the elements of that story. Since you were raised Irish Catholic, have you found yourself re-engaging with the sort of the Celtic mysticism of the Christian tradition? Because that's, of course, something we'll be talking about on this podcast.
Well, honestly, I have not. That's something that's been on my list for a while, but I haven't gotten a chance to dive into that more deeply. So that's exciting for me.
Yeah, that's something we'll explore together.
Awesome. Well, Stephen, we have covered quite some ground today.
I guess we have.
So we're going to end here, and we want to thank our listeners for joining us on this first foray into this topic.
Okay, thanks, Will. I'll look forward to our further conversations and really looking forward to this podcast series.
Dear friends and listeners, we've come to the end of this episode of Nature as Beloved, Nature as Self. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by liking, commenting, and sharing this episode with others. If you have a question you would like answered, are interested in learning more about a topic, or would like to pursue one-on-one spiritual direction with either of us, you can write to us at natureasbeloved@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram at natureasbeloved. For daily photos and quotes, you can follow Stephen on Facebook or Instagram at the Stephen Hatch Outlook. And for more information about Stephen's books, you can find them on Stephen K. Hatch's Amazon author page. Until next time, may you continue to walk in beauty, be well, and stay wild.